G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with clip 5, the conclusion to John Wyndham's story, The Puffball Menace, written sometime between 1933 and 1939, and which appears to be the very first time anybody has ever considered the idea of an asymmetric military, non-military, biological, chemical attack using genetically engineered plants against a Western nation by a third world country. So I think it's a kind of a significant story. In the 1930s, before World War II, there was a switched-on pommie who had the idea that the people in the developing world are getting very pissed off with the industrial West, and one day they might start using asymmetric warfare to attack the West in ways that the West will find very difficult to defend against. Let's go to the conclusion of the story. Chapter 5, The Attack on the Wind. Whoa! Beg, plead, grovel, excuse me for kicking the tripod. You get that when it's a malt liquor video. See? 1.8 standard drinks each. You try reading and drinking. Chapter 5, The Attack on the Wind. Some 6 nights later, Ralph sat with a group in the stable, which was their billet. One man was holding forth pessimistically. I suppose they're doing a bit of good with all this flame throwing and whatnot, but it ain't getting them far. It's the plant underneath what they want to get, not just the yellow balls, they're only the fruit. You don't kill an apple tree by knocking off the apples. Fungi have a sort of web of stuff spreading all through the ground around them. That's the life of the things, and that's what There came a thunderous knocking on the door and a stentorian call to turn out. Wind's rising, said the sergeant. You all know your jobs. Get to 'em and look slippy. The wind swept in from the Atlantic at gale force. The first few puffs stirred the yellow balls and rolled them a little at the ends of their skimpy stalks. Later followed a gust which twisted them so the stalks snapped and they were free to roll where the wind urged. As the pressure grew to a steady blast, it swept up a mass of the light balls and carried them bounding across the countryside, an army of vegetable invaders launching their attack to capture the land and destroy human beings. The wind of a week before had only moved the balls in the most exposed positions, but this time none but the youngest and least developed had the strength in their stalks to resist the air which tore at them. Every now and then a splashing flurry of white would spring from the hurtling, bouncing horde as the tough yellow skin of one was ripped by some sharp spike or the corner of a roof. Then the great spores themselves were caught up by the wind and carried on faster as an advance guard of the Yellow Army. The gale seemed to display a diabolical zest for this new game. It increased its force to drive the balls yet more furiously. Hedges, ditches and trees failed to check the headlong charge. Even rivers proved no obstacle with the wind behind. The balls sailed across in their thousands, bobbing and jerking on the rough surface. They were thrust relentlessly down narrow streets of the little towns, jostling and jamming against corners of the buildings until the houses were hidden in a cloud of swirling spores, and the surviving balls tore loose to follow bowling in the wake of their fellows. This time the wind did not desert them. Many lodged in sheltered hollows, but they served merely to fill them up and make a path over which the rest could travel. The wave of invaders climbed the slopes and swept up and out onto the moor, where unobstructed they gathered speed to charge yet more swiftly upon the defenders. There was a line of fire across the country. Ralph had soon learned the purpose of the broad trench. Filled now with blazing oil and wood, it formed a rampart of flame. Here they come, cried the lookout, clinging to a swaying perch high above. Soon all could see the few whirling balls which seemed to lead the way, and the turgid mass of yellow pressing close behind the outrunners. They held their breaths. The first balls hurled themselves to destruction on the Cheval de Frise, a a hedge of bristling spikes which slit and tore their skins and set free the spores to go scudding on into the flames. But they came too thick and fast. In many places they piled up solid against the sharp fence, forming ramps for those behind to come racing over the top and fall among the meshes of barbed wire. Every now and then a ball seemed to leap as though it possessed motive power within itself. Missing the wire, it would bowl across no man's land to a final explosion in the flaming ditch, its burning spores shooting aloft like the discharge of a monstrous firework. "My God," muttered the man next to Ralph, "if this wind doesn't drop soon, we'll be done. Look at that." That was one of several balls which, miraculously escaping all traps prepared for it, had leapt past them into the darkness behind. "They'll catch it in the nets back there and burn it when the wind drops," Ralph replied with a confidence which he scarcely felt. "The thing that worries me is that the fires may die down. We can't get near to fuel them from the lee side here." But, as luck had it, the fires outlasted the wind. "Men," began the officer in charge the next morning, "it was a pretty near thing last night, but we have to thank Providence that we successfully withstood it. But we can't afford to waste time. We've got to get to work at once. There may be another wind at any time, and that massive stuff choking the spikes must be cleared before it comes. I want every man who has experience of flamethrowers to step forward." Ralph, in company with many others, stepped out. He had no knowledge of flamethrowers, but it was the only way he could acquire an asbestos suit and get out into the danger area. For more than a week he had stifled his anxiety to know Dorothy's fate, and now he could bear it no longer. As he struggled into the heavy covering which would not only insulate him from fire but also withstand the deadly spores, he turned over his plan. Perhaps such a simple getaway was unworthy of the name of a plan. Roughly, it consisted in placing himself among the foremost of those who would be clearing the ground with their fire sprays, and working gradually ahead until the thickly scattered balls should give him concealment from the rest of the party. All he had to do was walk off to the west. The only risk once he was away was that one of the food-carrying planes might spot him. But the chance was remote, and it was unlikely that a lone straggler would be considered worthy of investigation. The scheme worked as he had expected. No hue and cry was raised after him as he wormed away. In a very little while he stood alone at the threshold of the stricken district. As far as he could see in three directions, the land was dotted with the yellow balls, poised ominously where the wind had left them, and seeming to wait for the next gale to pick them up and send them swirling onward to more victims. Surrounded by the evilly glittering skins, he shuddered for a moment before his determination reasserted itself. He drew a deep breath through his mask, threw back his head, and strode on, a lone grey figure, the only moving object in a scene of desolation. At the first village he found a motorcycle with its tank half full, and for 6 miles it shattered the silence of the moor as he drove it, zigzagging to avoid the growths which littered the road. Then came a sharp valley so choked with balls that he must leave the motorcycle, throw away the heavy flamethrower, and climb across the balls themselves. On several occasions one burst beneath his weight, and he dropped some feet in a flurry of spores which threatened to choke his breathing mask until he could wipe them away. Then laboriously he must pick himself up and struggle on, while streams of sweat soaked his clothing beneath the clumsy suit. Once he almost turned back to pick up the flamethrower with the idea of burning his way through the mass, but he remembered that its cylinder was already half discharged. Desperately he battled until at last his feet found the bracken and heather of the further hillside. Afterwards he could recall little of that journey. He became uncertain even of the number of days which passed as he tramped on and scrambled through one choked valley after another. Only odd incidents startled him now and then out of stupid weariness. The little town on the moor where men and women lay dead in the streets while the fungus preyed on them, and the windows of the houses were full of yellow balls which mercifully hid the rooms. The voice of a madman chanting hymns in a barricaded hut, hymns which turned to cursing blasphemies as he heard Ralph step outside. The things which had been men and which he was forced to move when thirst tortured him to find a drink in a dead inn. But somehow, with dulled senses, he strove on through the nightmare, while every mile he covered the fear of what he might find at his goal increased. He felt that when he was almost home, when he crossed the river Tamar, which separates Devon from Cornwall, the bridge was choked with the fungus. Upstream was wedged a solid mass of yellow, but below it the river raced, bearing an occasional serenely floating ball, which would later meet its fate before the fireboats in Plymouth Sound. At last, St. Brian. The balls were fewer here. The wind had carried most of them away. His own home, further on, Dorothy's home, blank, locked, deserted. He broke a window to enter and wandered about the empty rooms. No trace of fungus inside the house. No trace either of Dorothy. Perhaps she was upstairs. He was weak and hungry. Every step of the climb was an effort. At the door of her room he hesitated. Would she be there, the yellow balls growing from her, feeding upon her still body? He opened the door. Anything was better now than uncertainty. No one on the bed, no one in the room at all. He began to laugh hysterically. Dorothy had fooled the balls. They hadn't got her. She was alive, he was sure now. Alive in spite of those damned balls. He fell on the bed, half laughing, half crying. Suddenly, he stopped. A sound outside. Voices. Painfully, he crawled across to look out of the window. A group of people was coming up the road. People he knew. They were wearing ordinary clothes, and among them was Dorothy. Dorothy! He tore off his mask and tried to shout to them. Funny, his voice wouldn't work somehow. Never mind. Dorothy had fooled the yellow balls. That was damned funny. He was laughing again as he sank to the floor. Yes, dear, I'm real, said Dorothy at the bedside. But, how? When I got here, I found that Daddy had gone. The only thing for me was to go too. Several of us went down to the river in a boat and rowed along nearly to Land's End, right in the toe of Cornwall. We were beyond the balls, and to windward of them. Then, when it was safe... Safe? Yes, dear, it's safe now. The balls are just like an ordinary fungus now. They don't attack living things anymore. Then we came home and found you here. But not now. You mustn't talk any more, dear. You've been very ill, you know. Ralph acquiesced. He went to sleep peacefully, her hand in his, and a smile on his face. Envoy. The Prince Cordar of Gangistan regarded the nephew of Haramin bent low before him. Your plan has failed, he said. The nephew of Haramin nodded dumbly. But, continued the prince, it has cost that accursed country more than did ever our wars, and we have lost nothing. Tell me, why did it fail? Your Highness, the stock did not breed true. After 2 or so generations it was no longer a parasite, but had reverted to a common saprophytic fungus, which, however, it will take them many years to suppress. Many years, the other repeated hopefully. The Prince Cordar spent a few moments in contemplation. We are not displeased, he said at length. Doubtless the first arrow did not kill a lion. There are other means, nephew of Haramin. The bent figure heaved a sigh of relief. There are other means, he agreed. 1939, latest possible date for that to have been written, and John Wyndham was considering the idea of the Third World deploying asymmetric biological warfare against the West. Interesting to know, isn't it? Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.